The American dream that you were told about is in hospice. Your parents bought a house on one income. Today, two incomes aren't enough. That didn't happen by accident. Between the time you grew up and the world your kids and grandkids are living in today, something went terribly wrong. And it wasn't bad luck. It wasn't globalization. It wasn't your fault. What happened to the American dream was a deliberate decision, made in boardrooms and back offices by people who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly who would pay for it. In this video, we're going to name exactly who killed it, when they did it, and how they made sure you'd never notice until it was too late. Make sure you stick around to the end, because once you see this, you won't be able to unsee it. My father worked as a steel worker for 31 years. Punched in at 6 in the morning, punched out at 3. Bought a house in 1960, sent 2 kids to college, retired with a pension, never once held a second job. I want you to think about someone in your own life who did the same thing, because what I'm about to show you isn't just statistics. It's the story of how that life, the life your parents lived, the life you were promised, was taken apart piece by piece. And the people who took it apart left a paper trail. For the first 25 years after World War II, this country ran on a simple promise. You work harder, you produce more, you take home more. That's it. That was the deal. And it worked. Between 1948 and 1973, worker productivity and worker pay grew almost perfectly together. Productivity up 111%, worker pay up 90%. Not identical, but close enough that the average American family felt it in their paycheck every year. Felt it in the house they could afford, the vacation they could take, the college fund they could actually fill. That was real. That happened. I want you to hold on to that, because what comes next is going to make you angry. In 1973, that link was cut. Not gradually, not painfully slowly, cut. From that point forward, American workers kept getting more productive, faster, smarter, more efficient every single year. But the money those workers generated stopped following them home. Between 1979 and 2019, productivity in this country rose nearly 60%. Worker pay rose 15%. That gap, that 44 percentage point gap between what you produced and what you were paid, that's not a rounding error. That's the single largest wealth transfer in American history. And it didn't happen by accident. Here's the part they don't teach in school. 2 months before that link broke, a corporate lawyer named Lewis Powell sat down and wrote a memo that changed everything. August 1971. Powell was writing to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and what he wrote was essentially a declaration of war against the American worker, though nobody called it that at the time. Powell told corporate America it was under attack. From consumer rights movements, from labor unions, from environmental regulations. And he gave them a blueprint to fight back. Flood Washington with lobbyists, fund think tanks that would reshape public opinion, take the battle into the courts, coordinate, organize, and never stop. Here's what that blueprint produced in concrete numbers. In 1971, there were 176 corporate lobbying firms in Washington. By 1980, just 9 years later, there were 2,445. 9,000 lobbyists, 60,000 trade association employees, all of them working full-time to make sure the laws of this country served the people writing the checks, not the people punching the clock. I've been studying economic history for a long time, and I can tell you, the Powell Memo is the most consequential document most Americans have never read. It didn't just change policy, it changed who owns the policy. And we've been living in the world it built ever since. Now here's where it gets specific. Because the war Powell started needed weapons. And in 1982, the Securities and Exchange Commission handed corporate America the most powerful weapon it had ever been given. Before 1982, if a company tried to use its profits to buy back its own stock and artificially inflate its share price, that was considered market manipulation, illegal. After 1982, the SEC quietly changed the rules and made it perfectly legal. That single regulatory decision, which most Americans have never heard of, is directly responsible for hollowing out the industrial heart of this country. Here's why. Once buying back your own stock became legal, and once executive bonuses got tied to stock price, the math changed completely for every CEO in America. Why would you invest profits in your workers, your factories, your research, things that take years to pay off, when you could just buy back shares, watch the stock price rise, and collect your bonus by Thursday? Between 2003 and 2012, the 449 biggest companies in America took 91 cents out of every dollar they earned and sent it directly to shareholders. 91 cents. That left 9 cents for everything else. Worker raises, new equipment, research. 9 cents. There was a steel worker in Youngstown, Ohio, who worked at the same mill for 22 years. In 1982, the plant closed. Not because it was losing money, because the buyback math said the stock was worth more than his job. He was one of 12,000 workers who lost their positions that year in that region alone. I think about him every time I see these numbers, because manufacturing employment in this country peaked at 19.6 million workers in 1979. By the end of 2024, despite the fact that 100 million more Americans were alive, manufacturing employment had fallen to 12.9 million. Those weren't jobs that disappeared because robots got smarter. Those were jobs that got sacrificed so the stock price could go up before the quarterly report. But here's the part of this story that I think hits closest to home for a lot of people watching right now. Because this didn't just happen on Wall Street or in Washington. This happened in your HR department, in a meeting you probably weren't invited to. For most of the 20th century, if you worked for a major American company for 30 years, you knew exactly what you were getting when you left: a pension, a specific monthly check guaranteed for the rest of your life, no matter what the stock market did. The company made the investment decisions, the company took the risk. You just showed up, did the work, and collected what you were promised. In 1978, buried deep inside a tax bill that almost nobody read, Congress included a small provision called Section 401k. It was originally meant as a minor benefit for highly paid executives. A benefits consultant named Ted Benna noticed it 2 years later and realized it could be used for something much bigger: a company-sponsored savings plan where workers put in their own money. Corporate America saw what that meant immediately. And through the 1980s and 1990s, company after company made the same quiet decision: cancel the pension, offer a 401k instead. Now, here's what that switch actually meant, because the way it got sold to workers and what it actually did are two very different things. When your company had a pension, they were on the hook. Good year, bad year, market crash, recession, didn't matter. They owed you that monthly check. The risk was theirs. When they switched to a 401k, every bit of that risk moved to you. You decide how much to contribute, if you can afford to contribute at all. You pick the investments, whether or not you know anything about investing. And if the market collapses the year before you retire, the way it did in 2008, you don't get a do-over. You get whatever's left in the account. In 1979, about 38% of private sector workers had a pension, a guaranteed monthly benefit they could count on. Today, that number has fallen to roughly 15%. The rest got a 401k and a brochure explaining compound interest. What gets me about this isn't just the math, it's the framing. Corporations told workers this was actually better. More freedom, more control, more flexibility. And some workers believed it. What they didn't say was that freedom meant freedom for the company, freedom to eliminate a guaranteed obligation from their balance sheet, freedom to stop being responsible for whether their workers could afford to retire. The American retirement system didn't collapse by accident. It was replaced, deliberately, methodically, over about 20 years. And the people who made that decision did it because it was good for their quarterly earnings report, not because it was good for you. Here's what that forced American families to do. When the paychecks stopped keeping up and the pension was gone, American families didn't just accept it. They did what they were told to do. They borrowed. The credit card went from a luxury item to a survival tool. Student loans went from an occasional necessity to a mandatory rite of passage. And here's what that produced. As of the fourth quarter of 2025, total household debt in this country stands at $18.8 trillion. $18.8 trillion. That includes $1.28 trillion in credit card balances alone. And here's the number that stopped me cold when I found it. When researchers asked American adults whether they could cover an emergency expense of just $400, not $4,000, not $40,000, just $400, 37% said they could not cover it in cash. 13% said they couldn't cover it at all, by any means. This is not a poor country. This is the wealthiest nation that has ever existed on Earth. And more than a third of its people cannot handle a $400 emergency. That is not a personal finance problem. That is what happens when 50 years of wage stagnation and eliminated pensions forces a generation to replace real earnings with borrowed money. The debt didn't create the crisis. The debt was the crisis in disguise. You've probably felt what happened to housing in your own family, but I want to show you the math in a way that makes the scale impossible to ignore. In 1960, the median home cost $11,900. The median household income was $5,600. That's a ratio of 2.1, meaning a home cost roughly 2 years of household income. By 1985, that ratio had risen to 3.5. By 2022, it hit 5.6. Today, it sits at 5.0, a median home price of $416,900 against a median household income of $83,150. My father bought his house at a 2.1 ratio. Your kids are trying to buy at a 5.0 ratio, on wages that haven't kept up with inflation, while competing against cash offers from institutional investors. That's not a housing market. That's a locked door. And college. In the 1970s, a student could cover a full year of public university tuition by working roughly 260 hours at minimum wage, a summer job. Today, covering the same tuition at minimum wage requires 1,350 hours. That's 26 hours a week, every week, year-round, while also going to school full-time. The ticket that was supposed to get you into the middle class now requires going into debt before you've earned your first dollar. Meanwhile, and I want you to really feel this number, in 1965, the average CEO made 21 times what the average worker made, 21 to 1. That ratio was high, but it was at least recognizable as human scale. By 2024, the average CEO of an S&P 500 company made 285 times the average worker. And between 1978 and 2024, total CEO compensation grew by 1,094%. Not the company's revenue, not the workers' wages, the CEO's personal pay, 10 times over. If you want to know what happened to the money your productivity generated, that's where it went. I know some of you watching this right now are thinking, well, the government should have stopped this. And you're right, they should have. But the government had been systematically taken apart, piece by piece, starting with the Powell Blueprint. In 1981, the top marginal tax rate was cut from 70% to 50%. That's the rate that used to make obscene executive payouts genuinely painful. When taking a $50 million bonus meant giving 70 cents of every dollar back, companies thought twice. After 1981, they stopped thinking twice. In 1999, the last major wall between regular banking and high-risk investment gambling was torn down. The law that built it, Glass-Steagall, had been passed after the Great Depression specifically to prevent banks from gambling with the savings of ordinary Americans. Repealing it didn't just open a door, it blew up the building. And then came 2008. I think most of you remember where you were. What I want you to know is what the government actually did with your money when everything collapsed. The total rescue package for the financial system came to $443.5 billion. $443 billion for the banks. The banks that created the problem. The banks that packaged bad mortgages into fraudulent products and sold them to pension funds. For them, $443.5 billion. Fast, no questions. For the homeowners those same banks had preyed upon, the people who lost their houses, their savings, their retirement accounts, Congress allocated $37.5 billion. And of that $37.5 billion, only $16.3 billion was actually paid out over 6 years. Banks, $443 billion. Homeowners, $16 billion. That is the moment the American social contract didn't just bend, it broke. In public, with documentation, and almost nobody went to jail. The CEO of Countrywide Financial, the company that wrote more fraudulent mortgages than any other lender in America, walked away with $87 million in compensation. The families he foreclosed on got a phone call. Here is where all of this has landed. In 1971, 61% of Americans lived in middle-class households. By 2023, that number had fallen to 51%. And the wealth that left the middle class didn't disappear, it concentrated. Today, the top 1% of Americans holds 30.8% of all the wealth in this country, nearly $49 trillion. The bottom half of the country, 165 million people, holds 2.5%. Let me say that again because I think it deserves to be heard clearly. The top 1% holds $49 trillion. The bottom 50% holds 2.5% of what's left. This didn't happen because some people worked harder than others. This happened because the rules were rewritten systematically over 50 years to make sure that the money your labor generated went somewhere else. The memo was written in 1971. The lobbyists flooded Washington through the 1970s. The buyback rules changed in 1982. The tax cuts came in 1981. The pensions disappeared through the 1980s and 1990s. The banking walls came down in 1999. The crash came in 2008. And the bill went to you. My father's deal, work hard, buy a house, retire with dignity, wasn't just his good luck. It was the result of a system that was deliberately built to share what workers produced. That system was deliberately dismantled, and the people who dismantled it knew exactly what they were doing. That's what I think people need to understand. Not that the American dream faded, not that times changed, but that specific people made specific decisions, signed specific documents, passed specific laws, and those decisions, documents, and laws transferred wealth from the people who produced it to the people who owned it. The dream isn't dead because the world got harder. It's dead because it was killed. And the first step to getting it back is knowing exactly how it happened. Have you felt this in your own life? Or watched your kids struggle with something your parents did easily? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to hear your story. And if this video opened your eyes, make sure you're subscribed, because the next video exposes the single company that's been profiting from everything we just talked about, and there's a good chance their name is already in your retirement account. This is EconoNova. Stay informed.